Thank you, General Breedlove, for your service to our country. Thanks for being here with us today. I want to start just by reiterating a concern expressed by my colleague, Senator Manchin. It worries me that the U.S. accounts for about 3/4 of NATO funding, even though the European members have an even larger combined economy and population, and that defense spending in European countries has decreased by 28% since 1990. And meanwhile, just over the last 12 years, Russia has increased its defense budget by over 100%. And so this worries me a little bit, especially given that I think there are some additional uncertainties that could come into this in light of President Obama's request to quadruple funding for the European Reassurance Initiative in fiscal year 2017. Worries me about, among other things, what this could say about the willingness of our European allies to increase and modernize their own defense systems. But on that note, given the fact that he does want to quadruple the funding for the European Reassurance Initiative to $3.4 billion, now the Russian government is obviously not going to be taking this announcement happily, and the objective of this spending is, of course, to reassure our European allies that we're committed to their defense and we're committed to doing what we can to try to deter any further Russian aggression. But I'd like to ask you, what are the chances that this spending, this increased spending, might have the opposite effect, and that the Russian government might use increased spending levels in this area, both as propaganda and as sort of a public relations excuse to increase Russia's own military buildup along its western border or activity in Eastern Europe? And how are you addressing the potential that we could, in one way or another, unwittingly, unintentionally, be catalyzing an arms race on the Russian border with Eastern Europe?
So thank you. It's a complicated question. If I could dissect it just a little bit to the front end of the question about the concern of the investment of our NATO nations. Clearly, we are focused on all of the nations addressing their individual requirements. As we discussed earlier, Article 3 of the Atlantic Treaty is essentially, in my words, defense begins at home. In other words, nations are required to prepare for their own defense. The numbers I use, sir, are probably exactly wrong. They fluctuate a little bit, but here are the numbers that are pretty widely accepted. Since Wales, 16 of our nations have stopped their decline in defense spending. 5 of the nations have, at this moment, are investing 2% or better. And now, my personal opinion, not that of our government or others, is there's about 7 of the nations that I think have a very creditable internal plan to reach 2% within a creditable amount of time. At Wales, the decree said in 10 years. I think that a shorter time frame would be a more appropriate.
17 nations?
7.
7 nations that would get there.
So what we see, again, this is not to be overly optimistic, but I'm just reporting sort of what we see now, is that the nations have taken notice and are beginning to address the issues. To this latter half of your question, which is the Russian reaction to ERI, everything we do in Europe, the Russians react to. Everything we do in Europe, they use as a part of their propaganda campaign. Every small exercise, every big exercise, every investment. When we fly a couple of bombers in an exercise, it gets big notice. And as you have seen, they have a steady flow of aircraft into our area. So I do not want to belittle what you're concerned about, the opposite effect in propaganda. Sir, they're already talking about ERI in their propaganda efforts to discredit what we're trying to do. And I would offer you my opinion, which will sound a bit strident. But I believe that Russia is on a path right now to recapitalize, reinvest in its military, and it's moving forward in that effort, and it will use things as an opportunity to label them as a reaction. But I believe they are on a scheduled plan, and they're executing their approach to recapitalization, reinvestment, reinvigorating, and probably most disturbingly, to use their military, as you have seen them use it in Crimea, Donbass. Very few talk about they reset the line recently and violated Georgian territory again by moving the line about 1,600 meters south in South Ossetia to cover an energy transmission point. And now you see what's going on in Syria. So, sir, I think they're on a schedule, and they're going to execute that schedule. They'll use whatever they can to address the propaganda piece to talk about it.
Thank you very much, sir. See, my time is